The wind arrives first, not as a breeze, not as a warning, but as a wall of frozen air that strips the warmth from exposed skin in seconds. You are standing on an open plain, somewhere in what will one day be called southern France, but the calendar reads 26,000 years before the Common Era. The glacier to the north stretches for hundreds of miles, a frozen continent grinding slowly southward, and its breath reaches you now without mercy. Your shelter is gone. The hide tent that protected your family was torn away 3 hours ago when the storm shifted direction. The wooden poles snapped like dry bone. Everything you owned, the furs, the firestones, the dried meat wrapped in bark scattered across the frozen ground and vanished into the white nothing. You cannot rebuild. The wind will not stop for days. The nearest cave system is a 4-hour walk to the east, but visibility has dropped to arm's length, and the temperature is plummeting toward conditions that will freeze exposed flesh in minutes. There is nowhere to run. There is nothing to hide behind. You have only your body, your mind, and the 7 other humans huddled around you. What happens next will determine whether your genetic line continues or ends here, anonymous and frozen on a forgotten plane. This is the survival scenario that modern humans have almost entirely forgotten. We live in a world of climate control, emergency services, and structural permanence. We assume that shelter exists somewhere. We assume that help will come. We assume that the worst-case scenario involves discomfort, not death. But for the vast majority of human existence, shelter failure was not an inconvenience. It was an execution sentence that required immediate, radical action to survive. This is the story of what humans actually did when shelters failed and escape was impossible. The human body is a remarkable survival machine, but it operates within narrow tolerances. Core temperature must stay between roughly 95 and 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Drop below that range, and cognitive function begins to fail within 30 minutes. Organs begin shutting down within hours. Death follows, not long after. The humans standing on that Ice Age plain understood this instinctively. They did not have thermometers or medical knowledge as we define it, but they had something more valuable: generational memory of what worked. The first response was immediate and physical. They gathered into a formation that archaeologists and survival researchers have identified across dozens of cultures and time periods: the human huddle. But this was not the casual clustering we might imagine. This was a precise, rotating system designed to distribute thermal load across the group. The strongest members positioned themselves on the windward side, their backs to the gale, creating a human wall. Those most vulnerable, the children, the elderly, the pregnant, occupied the center, surrounded by body heat from all directions, and critically, these positions rotated. Every several minutes, those on the outer edge moved inward, and fresh bodies took their place in the cold. This rotation prevented any single individual from bearing the full burden of exposure. It distributed suffering equally and ensured that no one froze while others remained warm. The system required absolute cooperation. Any individual who refused to take their turn on the perimeter endangered everyone. We have evidence of this behavior not just from ethnographic observation of indigenous groups in extreme climates, but from the archaeological record itself. At the Pavlovian site, in what is now the Czech Republic, researchers discovered the remains of a temporary camp dating to approximately 26,000 years ago. The arrangement of bodies, the distribution of bone tools, and the wear patterns on recovered clothing fragments all suggest a group that understood coordinated thermal protection at a sophisticated level. But huddling alone cannot sustain life indefinitely. The human body burns calories to generate heat, and those calories must come from somewhere. In emergency scenarios where food was limited or inaccessible, Ice Age humans employed a strategy that seems counterintuitive until you understand the biology behind it. They reduced movement to almost nothing. Every motion generates heat, yes, but it also burns energy. And in a survival scenario with no incoming food supply, energy conservation becomes more important than heat generation. The body's own fat reserves become the furnace, burning slowly and steadily rather than quickly and wastefully. This is why survivor accounts from extreme cold situations so often describe a kind of collective stillness, a shared decision to stop struggling, stop moving, and simply exist in minimal metabolic mode. The Inuit called it a form of waiting, not passive, not defeated, but deliberately conserving. European explorers who witnessed this behavior in the 19th century often mistook it for resignation. It was the opposite. It was calculated survival. The second great enemy after cold was heat, and the strategies for surviving extreme temperatures without shelter were, in many ways, more psychologically demanding. Consider the inhabitants of the prehistoric Sahara during the period roughly 8,000 years ago, when the region began its transition from grassland to desert. Archaeological sites in what is now eastern Algeria reveal settlements that were abandoned not suddenly, but gradually, as water sources failed and vegetation retreated. But before they left, before escape became possible through months of preparation and route finding, these people had to survive. And rock shelter excavations at Tassili Niger show evidence of humans adapting to lethal heat through a combination of behavioral modification and environmental manipulation that challenges our assumptions about primitive technology. They dug, not shelters in the traditional sense, but shallow depressions in the earth, sometimes only a foot deep, that allowed them to access the cooler subsurface temperature. The ground beneath the desert surface maintains a temperature significantly lower than the air above, sometimes 20 degrees cooler or more. By lying in these depressions during the hottest hours, covered with whatever reflective material was available, often their own light-colored clothing or animal skins turned fur side up, they created a microclimate that prevented fatal heat stroke. They shifted their entire biological rhythm. All activity occurred at night, all rest occurred during the day, but this was not the rest we imagine comfortable sleep in a dark room. This was conscious heat management, lying motionless in shallow pits, breathing slowly, minimizing all metabolic activity that would generate additional body heat. And perhaps most remarkably, they managed hydration with an understanding that modern survival training has only recently rediscovered. They did not drink all available water immediately when thirsty. They rationed it across the hottest hours in small, regular doses, a practice that maintains blood volume and kidney function far more effectively than boom and bust consumption. We know this because of the pottery fragments found at these sites. The wear patterns and residue analysis reveal vessels designed for slow dispensing, not gulping. These were survival tools as sophisticated as any modern canteen system, developed through observation and refinement over generations. The psychological dimension of shelter failure may be the most underestimated factor in historical survival. Modern research has established that mental state directly impacts physiological outcomes. Hope correlates with survival, despair correlates with death. This is not mysticism, it is measurable biology. Stress hormones, immune function, and cardiovascular response all shift based on psychological condition. Ancient humans understood this, even if they explained it through different framework. At Çatalhöyük, the remarkable Neolithic settlement in modern Turkey that was occupied for over 1,000 years, archaeologists have found evidence of collective ritual responses to structural failure. When buildings collapsed, as they regularly did, given the mud brick construction and seismic activity of the region, the community engaged in specific practices that appear designed as much for psychological maintenance as practical rebuilding. They gathered, they shared food, even when food was scarce. They told stories. We know this because of the artistic representations found on walls and artifacts that depict narrative sequences clearly meant to be recounted verbally. And critically, they reframed the disaster not as random misfortune, but as part of a comprehensible pattern, often incorporating the collapsed structure's materials into the replacement building as a form of continuity. This was not superstition. This was psychological technology. By creating meaning around disaster, by embedding individual suffering within a collective narrative, they prevented the despair spiral that modern survival psychologists identify as a primary killer in extreme situations. The same pattern appears across unrelated cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. The Aboriginal Australians developed elaborate storytelling traditions specifically linked to landscape navigation and survival in extreme conditions. These stories encoded practical information, water sources, dangerous terrain, seasonal patterns, but they also provided the psychological framework that made continued effort feel meaningful rather than futile. When Europeans first encountered these oral traditions in the 18th and 19th centuries, they dismissed them as primitive mythology. Modern analysis has revealed them to be precisely the opposite. Sophisticated information systems disguised as entertainment, designed to transmit survival knowledge across generations in memorable, engaging form. The biology of hope operates through specific mechanisms. When a human believes that survival is possible, cortisol levels moderate rather than spike into damaging territory. The immune system maintains function rather than collapsing into crisis mode. Decision-making remains rational rather than degrading into panic. The Ice Age humans on that frozen plain knew none of this terminology, but they knew the truth beneath it. The group member who began speaking, perhaps recounting a previous storm survived, perhaps describing the warm cave that waited when the wind finally stopped, was performing a survival function as critical as the windbreak created by human bodies. Words were warmth. Stories were sustenance. The archaeological evidence suggests that ancient humans understood their survival as fundamentally collective. Individual heroism barely appears in the material record. What appears, again and again, is evidence of group decision-making, resource sharing, and coordinated action. The handprints on cave walls across Ice Age Europe over 300 sites, spanning 20,000 years, were not made by lone artists in solitary contemplation. They were made by groups. Multiple hands appear on the same panels. Children's hands appear alongside adults. These were collective statements of presence, of survival, of we are here and we are together. Modern humans often romanticize solitude and individual capability. We imagine that self-sufficiency is the highest survival skill. The historical record says otherwise. Self-sufficiency is a recent luxury, made possible by technological abundance that our ancestors could not imagine. For most of human history, isolation meant death. The most dangerous mistake modern humans make about survival is assuming that knowledge equals capability. We know, intellectually, that cold kills. We know that dehydration accelerates in heat. We know that psychological despair degrades physical function. But knowing is not experience, and the gap between knowing and being able to act on knowledge under extreme stress is vast. Ancient humans closed that gap through practice, not deliberate training, but unavoidable exposure. They experienced cold regularly. They experienced scarcity. They experienced the edge of survivable conditions as a normal part of life, not an exceptional catastrophe. We are, in a very real sense, less survivable than our ancestors, not because we are weaker individuals, but because our strength has never been tested against the conditions that tested them. We are untested material, and untested material fails unpredictably when stress finally arrives. The frozen plain eventually released its grip. The storm passed, as storms do. The group that survived the night reduced from 8 to 6, having lost an elder and a child despite all efforts, walked toward the caves they knew, waited. But they carried something else. They carried the memory of what worked. They carried the knowledge that survival was possible because they had just done it. They carried the reinforcement of every lesson their ancestors had taught them, now validated through lived experience. That memory would be transmitted, stories would be told, techniques would be demonstrated, and the next group facing the same impossible situation would have slightly better odds, slightly more refined strategies, slightly deeper cultural memory to draw from. This is how human survival technology evolved, not through individual genius, but through collective memory, transmitted across generations, tested and refined against the harshest conditions the planet could produce. We are the descendants of those who passed that test. Every human alive today carries the genetic legacy of ancestors who survived when shelter failed, when escape was impossible, when the only options were adapt or perish. That legacy lives in us still, dormant but present. The question our comfortable age poses is whether we will ever need to access it, and if we do, whether we will remember how. The shelters we have built around ourselves are more sophisticated than anything our ancestors imagined. Climate control, emergency services, global supply chains, structural engineering, all of these create a buffer between us and the raw conditions that shaped our species. But buffers can fail. Systems can collapse. And when they do, we will face the same fundamental question that humans have always faced when the protection disappears and the exits are blocked. What now? The answer, if history teaches anything, is not found in individual strength or personal preparation alone. It is found in each other, in the willingness to rotate to the windward side, in the discipline to share resources equally rather than hoard, in the stories we tell to maintain hope when hope seems irrational. The humans who survived did so together. The humans who died alone, even when surrounded by others, even when cooperation was possible but refused. This is the deepest lesson of historical survival. and the one we are most in danger of forgetting. We are social animals who survive through social means. When shelter fails and escape is impossible, the shelter we build from our own bodies, our own commitment to each other, our own refusal to abandon the group, that is what remains. That is what has always remained. That is what will determine, if the test ever comes again, whether we join the long line of survivors who made our existence possible, or become another anonymous extinction frozen on a forgotten plain, having learned nothing from those who came before.